time, I'd like to introduce our last patient speaker. Maria Demois, she is a 5-year stomach cancer survivor. She is retired and lives with her husband in Oakville, Ontario, Canada. Please welcome Maria.
When I started my cancer journey, I was already in a pretty precarious state. My husband Tim had finished undergoing chemo and radiation for lymphoma less than 6 months before I finally went to my GP for what I thought was heartburn. I had no weight loss, which I would have welcomed as I was heavy back then, or fatigue, but I did admit to feeling stressed for my role as Tim's caregiver over the past year. So when it felt like my esophagus was on fire while drinking my morning coffee, I finally saw my doctor. He started me on Tecta and initiated some tests. They revealed that I had H. pylori, and an upper GI series of x-rays suggested considering a gastrointestinal referral due to abnormal fold thickening in the stomach. As I waited from that October in 2015 until May of 2016, about 6 months, for a consultation and endoscopy, I had started feeling much better as antibiotics had cleared the H. pylori and the Tecta was helping the heartburn. But despite feeling better, the results of the endoscopy was that, at the age of 61, I was diagnosed with, and I quote, invasive, poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma composed of ill-defined clusters and linear strands of small tumor cells with focal formation of tiny glands and signet cell rings. I felt like my head was going to explode right in the doctor's office. My first thought was a memory of my neighbors at our first house. They had both got cancer within a year of each other, and how at that time I had kept asking myself, just how could anybody be so unlucky? Then I panicked. Who would be my husband's caregiver if something happened to me and his cancer returned? We didn't have any children. What if I died from this cancer? Who would look after him? I was told right away that I would need surgery to have my stomach removed. Amazingly, my reaction was to try and negotiate with the doctor. I immediately had this overwhelming need to feel like I wasn't, again, losing control of my life to cancer. Just my own this time, not my husband's. So I countered by asking if I could possibly just have chemo and radiation instead. On being told a definitive no, I asked what stage I was at. They couldn't tell. I would need to have an ultrasound and CT scan, as there were also some undetermined spots on my liver that needed further investigating. I was then consumed with rage. How could I agree to such a surgery under those circumstances? If it turned out that I was at a late stage with no real chance of adding significantly to my survival, I didn't think I wanted to go through any surgery. All this happened in just the first few minutes of hearing my diagnosis. It was only then that a very inconvenient, non-medical detail also popped into my head. We had just sold our home to move back nearer to Toronto as my husband had decided to retire a little early. We were going to be moving from London to Oakville the day before my surgery was to take place. After consultations with a surgeon and 2 oncologists, it was decided I would not be able to have any treatment beforehand due to the yet unknown stage of my cancer. I went into the operating room uncertain if I was going to have a total or subtotal gastrectomy. It wound up being a subtotal involving the lower part of my stomach. I had about a quarter of it left. The tumor was over 3 centimeters, through to the surface of the stomach, but there were no lymph nodes or other organs involved, and the spots on my liver proved to be nothing. I was declared stage 2B. I didn't do well after the surgery. My estimated 4-day stay turned into 11 days. I was on TPN for most of that time and totally nauseous until I went off all pain medication. When I started trying to eat, I immediately had dumping syndrome. I wanted to go home, but my blood work wasn't where it needed to be, and so I was kept in the hospital as the doctors tried to decide if I should have a transfusion or not. When I got out, things moved slowly, but I did make progress. Initially, the dumping syndrome made it difficult for me to even go out for a walk, so I literally made maps of all the available washrooms and benches where I could stop and rest on my routes. I was absolutely determined to get out, and this was the only way it was possible. I was able to eat small bits of food, and after a few weeks managed things like an egg with half a slice of toast, and the dumping syndrome was starting to get better. This is okay, I thought. It was the end of September when I started my treatments at the Juravinski Cancer Center. I was on the McDonald protocol, receiving 5 FU with leucovorin, scheduled for 5 rounds of chemo with 5 weeks of radiation simultaneously, starting during the second chemo round. Things got bad very quickly. By the 5th day of my first chemo round, I was starting to feel nauseous and had mouth issues. By October, I started losing weight as I couldn't eat because of the nausea. Once the radiation started, I needed hydration frequently and was dropping even more weight. I was so weak that at times I couldn't even stand up to shower, and I needed help getting in and out of the bathtub. Some days I had to use a wheelchair to get around in the hospital for my treatments. My 4th round of chemo was delayed. I continued to receive daily hydration, and since none of the many anti-nausea drugs I had tried worked for me at all, I was sent to a symptom management team who also weren't successful in helping me. My 4th round of chemo finally began on January 6, 2017, and by the end of the month I was in an ambulance heading for my local emerge because of chest pains. I thought I was having a heart attack, but I had a pulmonary embolism and was sent home, started on fragment. But the next evening I was back in the emerge again with a fever over 38 Celsius, being checked out for an upper respiratory tract infection and or viral pneumonia with sepsis and early shock from chemo. It was so bad that both my husband and I were convinced I wouldn't be coming out again. I was in there for a week, missing the start of my 5th chemo round. When I finally got back to the oncologist at Juravinski, all further treatment was canceled, so I never did complete the protocol. Over the course of the next few months, besides dealing with the blood clot, I started fainting frequently. It didn't turn out to be a heart issue as originally thought, but my blood pressure taking extreme drops. I had a spontaneous kidney stone complicated by being on the blood thinners. I was anemic, needed iron infusions. I also needed B12 shots, large doses of vitamin D. Around a year later, I was getting a geriatric assessment because my brain fog was still so bad that I thought maybe I had some age-related issues happening at the same time as all my other problems. My upper arms burned, which made my hands shake, and although thoroughly investigated, no explanation was ever found. It has still never resolved, although it does happen less frequently now. And I was constantly fatigued, just constantly. I felt that I didn't understand my own body anymore. Where were my familiar signals like you're in pain, you need to use the toilet, you're hungry? If I had any, I couldn't recognize them now. I hope that I've been able to paint a vivid enough picture of my life at that time so that you can actually feel the mental and physical state I was in when I began to confront what was going to be the most devastating and enduring part of my journey, and that was my new relationship with food. The one thing that had kept me going up to now had been my unshakable belief that when my treatment stopped, so would the nausea, and I would be able to eat again and start to recover. So it absolutely crushed me when things didn't happen that way. In total, I lost not the 20 pounds I had been warned I would probably lose, but around 68 pounds. I kept losing weight for a long time after my treatment stopped. I hit a low of 92 and I couldn't even sit comfortably. I was so bony. I was almost hysterical about it by then. I feared I would have to be put on a feeding tube, or maybe the weight loss just wasn't ever going to stop and I would literally waste away. Eating for me was an absolutely horrible process. I couldn't tolerate supplements like Boost. They went right through me. But I did do everything else I was supposed to do. Many small meals each day, which I did by the clock since I never felt hungry. I would make myself try to eat a little at least every 2 hours, even if it was only a couple of spoons of yogurt. I ate whenever I thought I could. I never waited for meals, as I might be too tired when they finally rolled around. And it was always protein first, and then anything else on the plate I could manage. When I ate, I felt as if I had run a marathon. I would get hot and sweaty and absolutely exhausted. Then would come what my husband called my food coma. I had to sleep immediately after eating. I had no control over that at all. I never drank before or during my meals. I also needed 15 to 30 minutes of complete rest prior to trying to eat. It meant I couldn't even stir a pot of soup in the kitchen without consequences. For if I tried to help in the meal prep, it meant I wouldn't be able to eat anything at all. Different types of foods worked for me one day and not the next, then back again without any rhyme or reason. I had to absolutely and strictly adhere to this routine, which took a long time to figure out, as it was the only way I was going to have any success. It was hard to believe I once loved cooking, eating, and all the social aspects of dining, especially coming from a cultural background where food was a major component of any gathering. All it meant for me now was discomfort and a rapidly growing frustration and sense of utility. I've never been a vain person and had always thought that, especially if faced with difficult health challenges, the last thing I'd be affected by was how I looked. But that didn't actually turn out to be true. By the time I had enough extra strength to take that first look in a full-length mirror, what I saw reflected was merely a skeleton clothed in baggy skin. If I walked by a shop window, I didn't recognize my own reflection. It was such an extreme change. When I became too small to fit into even size 0 petites, I had to start shopping in kids' stores like Oshkosh in order to get anything that fit, where unfortunately my options included a lot of glitter and unicorns. I got blown off the sidewalk by gusts of wind in the winter. When the passenger airbag light in our car kept coming on saying it wasn't functioning, we thought we'd better get it into the mechanic, not realizing I was the problem. I wasn't heavy enough to make the airbag system work. My husband started joking about putting me into a booster seat in the back to keep me safe. It's hard to tell you just how demoralizing it was to go through this on top of everything else. It was like every aspect of my identity was being erased. My team kept telling me that I should be gaining weight. I heard this at every 3 month, then 6 month, then 9-month checkup for a long time. There were scopes, swallowing tests, all kinds of consultations with specialists in an effort to explain why I continued to have such severe problems with eating. They all proved futile. I didn't seem to be meeting any of the progress markers that I was supposed to. When my eating started to improve, I still diligently tracked my daily intake. It soon became apparent that while I was taking in enough calories, I still couldn't even maintain my weight, much less gain anything. I began to feel more hopeful when eventually I did start to feel hunger again, but still nothing changed. That's when I was overwhelmed with the feeling that I was a complete and abject failure. A failure to my team, my caregiver husband, and myself. Despite all their efforts and my own certainty that I was trying to do everything possible to improve my situation, I couldn't even manage to do something as basic as eating. Around that time, I finally connected with Teresa and Katie at My Gut Feeling. It was like a lifeline for me. Here were a group of people like myself, surviving but not without their struggles, even in some cases for many more years than me. I was ecstatic that often the experiences of the group aligned with my own, and began to think that maybe I wasn't so abnormal for a person living without a stomach. Maybe the expectations of what should be happening and when, whether they were my own or my team's, just weren't founded in any reality. For that would mean that we were pretty much all underachievers. I can't tell you how reassuring it was for me. It was around 2 years after my treatments had finished that my weight finally stabilized. It took another full year after that before I started gaining a bit. I am 102 on a good day right now and don't see myself as a walking skeleton anymore. The car airbag functions and I can go into big girl stores again to buy my clothes. I manage a broader range of food now in somewhat larger quantities, but I still have to adhere to my rigid routine of how I eat, because that's what still works best for me, and I don't count on that ever changing. Inconvenient as that is, I find it better than the alternative consequences. And finally, last December, after 4 years, I reached what I felt was a major milestone. If I followed my routine, I could, at times, enjoy my food and not have any repercussions after eating. That's been a surprise and a pure joy for me. Next month will be my 5-year mark, and I will have what I've already been told will be my final CT scan and checkup at Juravinski, the notion of which I find both elating and frightening at the same time. Medical issues over the years since the surgery have been a real balancing act between my GP and my team. Until now, it's mostly been about knowing if the new problem is related to the cancer and/or treatment, or who can more quickly help me. But now, as I have to bid farewell to my team, is it reasonable to expect a GP to deal with someone who continues to be so compromised and challenged by living without a stomach? Survivors still have ongoing issues, and I really don't think we're their garden variety type of patient. Should there be another way forward for us that maybe currently doesn't exist in the system? It would be so reassuring to have something in between these two levels, as I feel I'm now definitely high maintenance for any GP, and I'm still selfish enough to want to continue getting the best care for myself as possible going forward. I don't know if I'll ever be able to stop looking over my shoulder, and maybe I shouldn't. Perhaps some continued vigilance even now would be wiser. I would like to add here that I am not without gratitude for the many good things that also happened to me during this long time. I am glad that I live in a country with universal health care so that my illness didn't bankrupt me financially, and that I was well looked after. I learned that most people, even strangers, will do anything that they can for you if you just ask, while your friends and family will go above and beyond anything you could have ever imagined. I am indebted to Wellspring and their cancer exercise program for helping me get back on my feet. They coached, encouraged, and inspired me beyond all expectation, and I firmly believe exercise lifted my mental outlook as well. Thanks to them, I am now a lifer at my local gym. My appreciation of all good things, no matter how insignificant, has grown exponentially because of my experience. I know that I owe so much more than I can express to my gut feeling and Teresa and Katie for giving me the emotional home I needed so badly. They helped me through all the hard times when I felt especially vulnerable and discouraged, uncertain of just about everything that was happening to me. And I surely have to thank my husband of 44 years, Tim. Since we have both experienced cancer in the dual roles of patient and caregiver, we are firmly in agreement that the only thing harder than experiencing cancer yourself is that overwhelming feeling of helplessness when it strikes somebody you love. If I could affect any changes because of what my journey has taught me, it would be to paint for everyone, whether patient or caregiver or physician, a much more realistic picture of what life after surgery and treatment is like for so many of us. I wish I could smooth the path for others and spare them some things because of what I've learned. I don't think you can expect to be eating normally and going back to work after a few months. If you can, that's great. But if you can't, you shouldn't worry that anything's necessarily going wrong or that you're doing everything badly. Don't worry endlessly that you're not meeting goals and expectations. Maybe we need to rewrite the manual about that. For many of us, progress just takes much longer than anyone ever imagines. It's common to find yourself struggling at different times. But things are always changing and you can't often control them despite everyone's best efforts. You're likely going to have good periods and setbacks both for a much longer time than you would think. Just remember to celebrate all your small achievements as Olympian victories, even if it's just getting out of bed in the morning, which I personally have used quite frequently. Your life may have a new normal, but you can find ways to cope with those changes or get whatever help you need. You need to be adaptive and patient and persistent to make progress. I'm really so glad to have had this chance today to share my experiences with you as I happily and gratefully turn the page on my journey to its next phase as a 5-year-plus survivor. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your story. You're such a special member of our My Gut Feeling family. And I personally can't wait to see you in person at our support groups in hopefully the near future. Your presentation made me cry and laugh because we've talked about so many other things.